Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as we winter sow allium seeds. So let's go. Today we're going to be winter sowing allium, which is a hardy perennial here where I live in New Hampshire Zone 5B. There are a lot of different types of ornamental allium out there. Some bloom in the springtime, whereas others bloom in the summer. The allium seeds that we're going to be sowing today are from the Serendipity allium plant. One of the easiest ways that you can propagate a summer blooming allium plant is through division. And I made a video showing you my process. What I'll do is put a link to that video down below as well as up above, in case you want to divide your own allium plant. This will be my first year trying to grow allium from seed. I'm really excited about it. I've heard that oftentimes allium plants will drop their seeds in place, and what you'll notice happening is you'll have little grassy blades showing up at the base of your allium plants. And the reason is allium plants very prolifically self-sow, or I've heard. I haven't had the plants very long in my own landscape. Some people treat them as a weed and they just pull out those little grassy blades. Other people very carefully dig them up and then move them around to other areas of the yard, or they can just gift them to other people. But since I saw my allium plants were going to seed, I wanted to collect the seeds and give it a try with winter sowing. I made a video showing my process for collecting allium seeds. I'll also link that video above as well as down in the description. In today's video, we're not only just going to winter sow these seeds that I collected, but I'm also going to answer some of the winter sowing questions that I've gotten from you. If you're new to the winter sowing process, my channel has a playlist specifically on winter sowing. It includes a lot of different videos that I've made over the last number of years. I'll put a link to that playlist down below as well as up above. So let's start with our first question. Do you buy or collect all these seeds from plants you have already grown? I have wanted to learn how to gather seeds from the seed heads of plants I've grown. A large majority of the perennial seeds that I like to winter sow are seeds that I've collected myself. However, I've also winter sown seeds that I've bought, and I do want to buy some seeds, but I'm going to hold back a little bit because I have a number of seeds that I collected that I definitely want to get to winter sowing this year. And I'm thrilled because I know a number of you have watched some of my older videos that I've linked in my playlist down below that show you my process for collecting seeds, and you've mentioned to me that you're going to be sowing those seeds this year, and I can't wait for us to grow some of those seeds together. But honestly, you can't go wrong with buying your own seeds. You're still saving a lot of money when you buy a packet of seeds and you winter sow or start those seeds indoors. It's so much cheaper than buying the actual plants. So I want to talk a little bit about this whole concept of winter sowing. A woman named Trudy Davidoff came up with the general idea or concept of the term winter sowing, but people have been sowing their own seeds for a long, long time, sowing them indoors or sowing them directly outdoors in the landscape. Trudy spent a lot of time and she worked with the USDA on this whole idea of winter sowing. And actually, there's a wonderful website that I like to go to. It's on Facebook, and it's basically a group that you can join for free. So much great information out there. They have moderators, they have admins, and as of right now, Trudy is also involved on that site. I'll put a link to that site down below for you to check out. I really enjoy going out to that site. I'm out there often looking up lots of different information having to do with winter sowing. Winter sowing has evolved year after year, and it's going to continue to evolve. There are so many different ways to do it, and I can't stress this enough. There is no right or wrong. Yes, there are lessons to be learned along the way when it comes to our own area and where we live, and also on the seeds that we're trying to sow. But what I want to stress to you is don't give up on the process. If you didn't have a good experience with it last year, try it again. Maybe change things on your end. Get information from my site or from that Facebook site or other people's sites, and then try to do what you think works best in your own garden. Now I'm going to answer the next question. I just recently heard about WS. That's often referred to as winter sowing. I want to give it a try. I have heard different opinions of where to place them though. Some say in a sunny place and others say in the shade, because in the sun they germinate prematurely. So I'm unsure about that. I'm in zone 8A. I want to sow flowers and some vegetables and later on tomatoes. Thank you for your advice and help. I'm almost sure when winter sowing first came about, it was really intended for plants that can handle cold, hardy perennials, or cool weather annuals and vegetables. But over the years, it's evolved. A lot of people have tried winter sowing everything and anything under the sun. And that's all fine, but you have to be really careful with those plants that will perish if they're hit by a frost or a freeze. It's doable, but it's going to take more work. I mostly like to just winter sow perennial seeds, and that's for a number of different reasons, but that doesn't mean you can't do annual flowers or annual vegetables. But let me answer the question. So when it comes to the placement of the milk jugs, you usually want to place them in a full sun area. During the winter time, the sun is at a lower point and it's very weak. So the milk jugs or whatever container that you're using is perfectly fine in that type of situation. However, as we leave winter and enter spring and then into summer, the sun starts to move, it's higher, it's more intense. So what's going to happen is eventually the soil will start to warm up, the seedlings will germinate, things will start to get hot inside of our containers. We're going to be opening the containers more often. We're going to be watering the containers more often. We might even be closing the containers on those cool nights in the late winter, early spring months. But what you'll find happening is it's going to get very hot in here. Because there's not a lot of soil in here, the soil is going to be drying out more frequently. You can definitely be watering this constantly as the soil dries out. Or what I like to do, and I know other people like to do this as well, is later in the season, once those seedlings are starting to grow and I'm finding that I'm watering in here way too often, I like to move my containers at that point into a shadier location. But I like to wait until the seeds have germinated, until it's starting to get almost too hot outside, where I feel like I can't keep up with watering my container. At that point, it makes it easier for me and it's a little less stressful on the plants if I move them into a shadier area. You'll find that I'm being very vague. I'm not telling you it has to be on this date or on this month. And that's because the growing conditions are going to vary where you are compared to where I live. As some of you know, I've already started the winter sowing process. The general rule of thumb is you want to wait until after the winter solstice, but you also want to wait until your nighttime temperatures are consistently below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. You're basically waiting for the coldest part of the year, when there's the least amount of likelihood for seeds to germinate. We've had very cold weather here in New Hampshire, extremely cold weather. I feel very comfortable starting the winter sowing process, and I've only winter sown perennial seeds so far. One thing I've learned with the winter sowing process is certain plants just take off super quickly. For example, cool weather annuals or cool weather vegetables, whereas other plants like hardy perennials are very slow to germinate, very slow to get to a big size. I guess what I'm saying is it's a process where you want to be patient. You want to be patient with seeds germinating. Different plants will germinate at different times. You want to be patient with your plants getting to be a nice big size, especially those perennials. Sometimes perennials will not bloom until the second year if grown from seed. You know the saying, they sleep, they creep, and then they leap. So just remind yourself, this winter sowing thing is a process. And when you grow plants from seed, especially perennials, you're doing it on a budget, so you just want to have a little patience. So I've done enough talking. Let's go ahead and winter sow this container here with our allium seeds. I like to use milk jugs for winter sowing. You can use whatever you like. Just make sure that your container is clear or translucent. Your container should have holes in the top to allow snow or rain to come in. And that's why I've thrown away the cap. If you find that you're running out of containers like this, you can reach out to local coffee shops. Oftentimes, they'll hold them aside for you for free. Your container should hold about 4 inches of potting mix. So I'm just going to go ahead and mark it where we're going to be cutting. I like to use heavy-duty cutting snips or shears just like this because it makes it a lot easier for me to cut my containers. You could use something like scissors or a razor, whatever you have on hand. But no matter what you use, just make sure you're safe if it's sharp. Whatever container you use, it should have drainage holes in the bottom, and the reason is you want water to be able to drain out. The larger your container, the more drainage holes you may need to add. There are different ways you can add drainage holes. I just like to use my cutting shears to do the holes. Other people have used the end of a hot glue gun. Some people have used a drill, and there are a lot of other things you can use to cut the bottom of your container. I like to cut the holes first and then cut my container over here. I find that cutting the holes first is a little bit easier because the container is still sturdier. When I cut, I'm going to be cutting starting right around here. I'm going to go almost all the way around, and I'm going to stop around here. And the reason I'm not cutting all the way through is because I want this section right here to act as a hinge. Eventually, when the seeds germinate, and I have seedlings in here, on the days that are warm, I'm going to have to open up my container, just like this. But then on the cooler days or cooler nights, if a frost is expected, I want to go ahead and close my container. So now you can see how this little hinge works on the end here. Now let's go ahead and fill our container with potting mix. I like to use used potting mix that I had in my summer container pots. You can also make your own potting mix, and I'll put a link to that down below. Or you can buy your own potting mix. Make sure you don't use seed starting mix because it dries out very quickly. If you're going to buy potting mix, make sure that it's a well-draining potting mix. You don't want the potting mix that retains moisture. Also, don't use heavy garden soil or compost if it doesn't drain well for you. No matter what you use, make sure that it's pre-moistened. After you've filled your container, go ahead and press down lightly to remove any air pockets. This will be my first year sowing Serendipity allium seeds. I've heard that sometimes the seeds do not come true to the parent plant because the parent plant is a hybrid, but I still thought it would be fun to try. If you decide to sow these seeds indoors, you may need to give them a cold period, so you would just want to pop these in your refrigerator. I have found different information on the internet on how long to keep them in your refrigerator, so you'll just want to research that a little bit more. I've heard that allium seeds need darkness to germinate. However, I've also heard other people say that the seeds that drop themselves out in Mother Nature germinated just fine without any intervention, meaning without anyone covering them. So when it comes to sowing the seeds today, we're just barely going to be sowing them under soil. I'm going to use the back of this pen and I'm just going to make a number of holes in the soil. I'm not making it very deep because, again, I don't believe that the seeds really need that much soil on top of them, just a very light amount of soil. The other thing I could be doing is sowing the seeds on the top and then taking my potting mix and covering the seeds after sowing them. And you can see the little holes that I made. That's just a close-up of what the allium seeds look like. So I'm just going to pop one seed in each of these holes. I am planning on doing multiple milk jugs with allium seeds in them. And then, like I said, I will also sow some of the seeds indoors under my grow lights. Now, onions that are a vegetable that we eat are also in the allium family. It's my understanding that onion seeds lose their viability over time, meaning the longer you hold on to onion seeds, the less likely those seeds are to germinate. So I believe when you collect your own allium seeds, just like these ones, that the same thing is true. That if I hold on to these seeds for a number of years, each year that goes by, the seeds are less and less viable. I do store my seeds in a cool, dark place. That way, they're hopefully staying as fresh as long as possible. I'm just going ahead and covering up each of these seeds that we sowed. I made a plant label and I'm going to keep it on the inside of my container. That way, if for whatever reason the label that's on the outside gets lost or worn off, we have a secondary label that's on the inside of our container. And I do like to use a garden marker. I find that they will last longer and they won't wear off as much as a Sharpie. You can also use an oil-based pencil or pen. For labels, some people like to use used Venetian blinds, or they like to use plastic knives. Another option is to take a used yogurt container and then cut it into little strips, and then you can use those as labels. Even though our potting mix is pre-moistened, I'm going to go ahead and give additional water. I just have a small hand water spray here just to mist the top, but you can use whatever you want for adding water in the top. Since we covered the seeds, I'm okay using a heavier stream of water. Other seeds that need light to germinate that I press into the top soil, in that case, the stream of water would be lighter. And the reason is I wouldn't want seeds to move around while I'm spraying. But that's not a problem with the allium seeds because they are under the potting mix. I'm just going to go ahead and wipe the side of my container because we added water and we're going to be adding tape next, and I want the tape to stick. I've been using duct tape for a number of years to close my containers. However, I've heard painter's tape works very well. In fact, it's a lot easier to remove from a container than duct tape. So if I were you, you could try either one, and I think either one would be fine. I've also heard of other people taking a hole puncher, punching a hole up here, punching a hole down here, and then sealing their container shut with something like a twist tie or a zip tie. Other people have actually cut the top all the way across, and then they nest the top part into the bottom part. And in essence, they're eliminating using any other thing like tape. The problem I find with that method is then I can't easily open and close my container, and also I can't easily pick up and move my container around. I have to pick it up like this. But try whatever method works best for you. I'm just going to use a small strip of duct tape and cut that off. And I'm going to place it on one side of my container. When it comes to winter sowing perennial seeds, I like to just use 2 or 3 strips of duct tape on my container. Some people like to tape their container all the way around. I have not done that for years, and this process has worked for me when winter sowing perennial seeds because these perennials are hardy in my area, and I found that it's not a problem. If a little cold air is coming in here, it doesn't affect my hardy perennials. However, if I'm going to winter sow a tender annual, like a vegetable plant or a flower that cannot tolerate a frost or a freeze, in that case, I would be putting tape all the way around. And now I'm going to label the outside of my container on the duct tape using my garden marker. And I used to label up here on my container, but I found that I can reuse my container for at least 2 years if I take good care of it. So for that reason, I like to label on the tape itself. And I only put the name of the plant on here. Other people like to put the date that they've sown their seeds. It's up to you how much information you want to put on there. And not everyone likes to write out the names of the plants. Some people just like to use some sort of a number system. So they have a piece of paper or they have a notebook, and on their container, they might just put a number, like number 1. And then in their notebook or on their paper, they would say 1 is equal to an allium. And then for the next container, they would do a number 2. And then in their paper, 2 is equal to whatever the plant is that's in that container. I'm also going to label the other side. This is totally optional. And yes, it's a little more work. The reason I do that is because when I'm outside and I have a whole bunch of containers, I don't want to keep turning the containers to look at the one side that the tape is on. So at least if I have it on 2 sides, it's just less work for me in the long run with looking at all my containers and seeing what's inside of them. It is a cold and blustery day here in New Hampshire, but I'm going to go ahead and place my container right here. And it is perfectly fine that we have snow out here. But if you are winter sowing in an area where you never get snow, remember, it doesn't matter. You can still winter sow. You just want to make sure that you're doing it during that coldest part of time where you live, which in the Northern Hemisphere typically falls starting in January onwards. You want to place your containers out in the open where snow or rain can come inside the holes that are in the top of your container. In other words, you don't want to place them under a covered porch, eaves, or anything like that. If your containers are out where it's very windy, you may need to put something around your containers to keep them from falling over. As a reminder, the seeds will germinate when the soil conditions and the temperature are conducive for those individual seeds. And different seeds germinate at different times depending on your climate. Time for our next question. This is my first year winter sowing. I heard you say you will pot them up. I thought they're supposed to go from the jug to the garden, which is why I did some winter sowing, to save indoor space. Is it that you're choosing to pot up first and then later place in the garden? That's the traditional way that people like to use the winter sowing method, is to winter sow their seeds, and then once their seeds are at the right size, about 1 to 2 inches in height, or have their first set of true leaves, whichever comes first, then they like to take the seedlings out of their container and put them out in the landscape. But then some people have found that that causes issues, maybe with pest pressure like slugs or snails or birds or other pests coming after their seedlings that are still small, still tender. Other people have found they've put their seedlings out in the landscape, and unfortunately the extreme weather caused their seedlings to perish. So if you do want to take your seedlings and put them directly out in the landscape from the container, what I recommend is maybe putting a cloche over some of the seedlings if you're finding that certain pests or certain animals are chewing the tops of your seedling. And then another thing you can do is you can provide shade of some kind to your seedlings so that they don't get too much sun. Or if it were me, I would just be planting my seedlings on a rainy, cloudy day. But that's correct. In many of my older videos, you have seen me take the seedlings out of their containers and pot them up or up-pot the seedlings. I like to do that for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is many times I don't know where I want my plants to go in my landscape. I need a little bit more time to think about it. Also, I find that it's a little easier for me to continue babying the plants. I can give them fertilizer, I can water them more frequently, I can protect them a little bit better. And while I'm doing all of that, I can still think about where do I want those seedlings to go in my landscape. And then sometimes I still don't know, so the seedlings end up going down in what I call my backyard plant nursery. It's basically a holding area in my yard. In fact, many times I'm growing seedlings for the purpose of selling them because I also sell plants. So it's a great place for me to just pot the plants up and move them down there. But that's definitely an extra step that a lot of people don't want to do. And I totally get that. So you can absolutely take your seedlings and just put them directly in your landscape. In fact, this year I am planning to do that with some of my seedlings, and I'll make videos showing you my process for taking them out of their container and putting them directly out in the landscape. Our next question is, how do you protect the seeds from freezing temperatures? How often do you water them? So if we're talking about the actual seeds, seeds themselves do not need protection from freezing cold weather. The seeds that I'm winter sowing today are going to be dormant. They're going to be placed outside. We might have some days that are negative 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and those seeds will be perfectly fine. However, once those seeds germinate, the plants that get formed, those are called seedlings. Some seedlings can take a little frost, even or a little freeze. Other seedlings cannot. The key is, if you're going to have cold temperatures that are dipping close to the freezing mark, you want to protect those seedlings. One way to do that is to close your containers up. Another way is to put some sort of a heavy blanket, comforter, or whatever you have that can add protection onto your containers. And then something that I've done in the past is actually just bring the containers into my unheated garage during those cold days or cold nights. I won't protect containers that have not germinated yet. I also won't protect containers that can take a light frost or even a freeze. So that might be something like my hardy perennials, for example. But once I've protected those containers during that small cold snap, I make sure to bring the containers back outside. That's really important. That's what this whole winter sowing process is about, is you shouldn't have to do a ton with your containers with moving them around. So I will just bring them back outside, and I'll continue on with monitoring them, giving them water, and protecting them as needed. In terms of how often do I water them? Well, from right now, probably through March, I will not have to water them again. The reason is they're actually just going to freeze solid. When they are out there and they're frozen solid for me, there is no need for me to water them. And some of them are even sitting under a pile of snow. Totally fine, and I'm not going to have to worry about them. But there will be a day that the snow will melt, and then the soil that's in those containers will not be frozen anymore. The soil will start to thaw out. And once the soil starts to thaw out, at that point, I need to really monitor the containers. The best way I like to do it is actually just to pick up the container. If it feels really light, that's a good indicator to me to give the container water. The milk jugs have a hole in the top of them, and I just take my spray water bottle and I do a light mist of water inside the container. Then I pick up the container again, and if it feels heavier, then I know the container is good. Where you live, your containers might never freeze solid, so you will definitely be checking your containers for moisture more often than me. And you have to ask yourself questions. Are you getting rain? Are you getting any sort of snow or any moisture going into those containers? And if not, you definitely want to be checking those containers. You want to be picking them up. And if they feel light to you, then be sure to give the containers water. There's no set answer in terms of check your containers every 2 days or something like that, because it really just depends on how much moisture you're getting where you live. Just be diligent. Don't forget about your containers. Check on them, pick them up. If they seem dry, give them some water. And if you have good drainage holes in your container and you also used a well-draining potting mix, then it shouldn't be a problem with watering them enough so that water is draining out from the bottom. Other people like to take their containers and put them in some sort of thing like a kiddie pool or something like that and bottom water their containers. If you are going to do that, it's important to just bottom water the container enough and then remove the container. You don't want it sitting in water because that will cause those roots to rot. Please drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever grown alliums from seed. And if so, how did you do it? Did you winter sow the seeds? Did you just take the seeds and scatter them out in your landscape? Or did you sow the seeds indoors under grow lights? And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.